been reflecting during the day on this nuance of our practice, more than a nuance maybe. We could say nuance, or we could say in some ways the whole of our practice, which we've been exploring as love, loving awareness, that relationship to experience that we've described as caring for, tending to, embracing, making space for what's happening. What we've spoken of as that which dissolves separation. And so I was reflecting today on just that relationship of love for love of practice. The necessity of that, really, the necessity of being in love with this way of living, really. Because of course, any real, if we talk about Dharma practice in the widest sense, definitely can't reduce that to meditation and come to a situation like this. This is a meditation retreat, right? So quite a lot of meditation. But just in that widest sense, if we want our, I'm trying to think of a better word than practice, but I don't really find one, our contemplative life, or just our interest in life, our love for life. And if we want that to really deepen and to really flourish and to really bear fruit, that needs a lot of love. And we just might recognize, the potency of love, how strong, just what happens when you're in love, and you fall in love with someone, just how much of your resources are marshaled in that person's direction. Oh, darling. What we'll do for love. Just how much of the energy and the emotional life is kind of canalized and directed toward the object of love. So it seems like, if we want a practice that's sustainable, that has momentum, that's going to carry us, to use the language of the tradition, all the way to the further shore, it needs a lot of love. And yet, of course, just since in the way that love can be so exquisite, so powerful, so arousing of strong intention and connection and all. And there's also that saying, of course, love is blind. Love can distort our view. Love can make us, foolish. Love can make us see things that are not really there. Or love can make us overlook things that are there and that would be better, noticed and considered. And it's a nice idea, right? To fall in love with one's practice. And maybe you have. Maybe you've, not everybody. People might start a meditation practice or get interested in Buddhist teachings or whatever, but they don't necessarily fall in love. Plenty of people come on retreat for the first time, for example, and maybe it was like that for you, first time you went on retreat, I don't know. Come like this. A little bit skeptical, or very skeptical. In 2019, I had a retreat here for activists and social and mostly environmental activists. And some of those people really didn't want to be here. by the couple of famous people here, Marion Cotillard, who maybe you know, but she's a very, very famous French actress, and she's won an Oscar. So she came for that and does an amazing amount to support activism in kind of quiet but impressive way. And so she made a few of those people come. And they didn't, a couple of them really didn't want to come, but she told them to come. And one of them, who's a kind of very well-known activist in France, his wife meditates. And for years, his wife has been encouraging him to meditate with no success. And then he was in trouble for coming on that retreat because however much his wife told him to meditate, it didn't make any difference. When Marion Cotillard said one time says it, he came. So it was interesting for me teaching that retreat to teach to the ones who were sitting there at the back, like this, you know, feeling skeptical. It's funny that the one that famous activist that came spent his work period planting all the lavender around the Tara Hall here. So I'm often reminded, you know, that his kind of contribution through the lavender, and you know, got somewhat turned on in the process. But anyway, so people might come, and even if they've not come because somebody famous has told them to come, they just come out of their own interest. But it's an interest that is tinged with some wariness, maybe some skepticism, some sense of what's in this for me. What am I going to get from this? What am I willing to give to this? What do they maybe want from me with this, etc. So it's very understandable, right? One might hold oneself at a certain distance from something until you've checked it out. Is it trustworthy? Is this place trustworthy? Is this person trustworthy? Is this practice trustworthy? So, you all have gone round several times, right? Some of you have been on dozens of retreats. You've at least been on several. So you might just consider, the extent to which you have fallen in love with this practice, the extent to which there's a love of Dharma. And there's some different aspects. When we say love of Dharma, it's a bit vague, so I'd like to sort of tease out maybe some of those aspects that we might fall in love with, some of the helpful ways of being in love, and also some of the maybe blinding ways, some of the ways we can fool ourselves if we're not careful. Because, you know, just like if you fall in love with someone, it's nice falling in love, but it doesn't last. After a while, that which seemed so endearing about them at the beginning, suddenly it's one of the things that's a bit annoying about them a bit later on. I remember reading that book, The Road Less Travelled, by Scott M. Peck. And he speaks about this process of first you fall in love with someone, and then inevitably you fall out of love, and then the work of love can begin. Once you've gone through that rather starry-eyed and unrealistic honeymoon stage, and then once you've recovered from the sort of disappointment when that person turns out to be not actually totally, completely perfect in the way they were supposed to be, then there's this, you know, the clarity and the sobriety in a way out of which to undertake the practice of love. And I think we could apply that same model, right, to a Dharma practice. First you fall in love with it. And you go, God, enlightenment, here I come. And then, it's hard work actually, and frequently disappointing. And so and then it's like, oh, maybe there then can come forth the clarity and the sobriety to just to give oneself to the work, the practice of how we go along the path. Maybe you fell in love with meditation. You sort of have to fall in love with meditation if it's going to be um, it's going to accompany you very far. And and yet, sometimes that falling in love can be a bit of like a one night stand or a one retreat stand. We fall in love in the retreat, and then at the end of the retreat we say, "Oh, darling, meditation. I'm going to take you home with me, and we're going to live together in great harmony, and we're going to make love every morning." And then after a few days, and that initial surge, it turns out to be was more, was more lust maybe than love. I don't know how far I can take this. I'll abandon it at any moment, this metaphor. But sometimes we fall in love with meditation but we're falling in love actually with some special experience. We're falling in love with that thing that happened on the retreat, that moment when everything got particularly quiet or spacious or peaceful or clear or whatever. And like we know, those moments don't last. If that's what we're falling in love with, not only is it not sustainable, but it's kind of inevitably disappointing. And a lot of people, maybe you've gone through that process of feeling somehow betrayed by meditation because it didn't live up to its promise or something, or it didn't live up to some great experience that one had with it early on. And then, much like with a human lover, we should trying to get back to some sweet thing we had going on at the beginning. But that sweet thing we had going on at the beginning, that belonged to the beginning. So, it's like that with meditation. We might fall in love with it, and then we fall out of love with it, and we feel it's not so accessible. And I go home and I try to practice, and it's not the same. And the nervous system isn't so quiet as it is on retreat, and mind isn't so clear. And and then that's where there's the opportunity, right, to engage in the practice of loving meditation, which means really, the practice of giving oneself to meditation, cultivating that sort of gentleness and patience and forbearance and commitment, just like with a human lover. Even in those moments, or especially in those moments where one's not getting the good stuff back, when one doesn't necessarily feel gratified by one's practice. Meditation can seem like a very ungenerous lover, because she, he, it, they, choose your pronoun for your practice, promises a lot. Meditation promises you peace and wisdom and enlightenment. And then what does it deliver? Boredom, restlessness, discomfort. Not only, not always, otherwise we wouldn't sustain, right? No, it does deliver. It delivers at least glimpses, tantalizing glimpses, momentariness, right, of that, in which we see the real depth and promise of our practice. But again, just like with a lover, you fall in love with someone, and there's this promise of great sex and deep intimacy and endless breakfasts gazing into each other's eyes. And then, after a while, many of the moments of that relationship are banal. Just being with them, just sitting in meditation. So, the skillful way to channel one's love for one's practice has to be loving the process, loving the whole. And loving, right, is different than liking. Sense of the willingness to love the process, to care for the process, to tend to the process, to love one's practice, whether we like it or not, whether what's happening is in the moment is gratifying or not. If we're dependent on gratification, we fall out of love quite easily. So what's it like? Just the invitation to that as an inquiry. What's your love of meditation like? And of course, in this moment, that might be somewhat colored by the situation. Day 3 of a 2-week retreat. Oh, what's the love of meditation like? Maybe, there's something you're just sort of slipping in and feeling that deepening, and the love of meditation is quite alive and accessible. And today you're feeling like, oh, there's nowhere else in the world you'd rather be. Or maybe it's, that day where, you're feeling some frustration and body is aching and things haven't really sort of smoothed out and gotten lighter and clearer yet. And the end of the retreat seems very far away. And there's some clouds of doubt around or whatever. So on the one hand, worth checking out. Oh, what's the love like that I have for meditation in terms of what's it like right now, but also just that zooming out. Like, how does my love of meditation actually sustain and carry in my life? So I'll start by talking about meditation, but of course, let's be clear. It's just one feature. It's the feature that gets a lot of the attention. Like I say, this is a meditation retreat, so okay. But so often when we even think of Dharma practice, or we think of life as a practitioner, how often, how easily meditation has a kind of disproportionate amount of space in that picture. Disproportionate to the amount of time one spends in meditation. If there's 24 hours in a day, how many of those are you spending meditating? 2 hours? Maybe. More likely 1 hour, maybe only half an hour, etc. It's a small proportion. So we look at the love of practice in terms of meditation, but we need a much more full spectrum picture for us, the kind of the love that can actually carry us along. Sometimes some people, some of the momentum of practice comes through falling in love with a teacher. I don't mean just in falling in love in terms of the erotic transference onto a teacher. Of course, that happens as well. But I mean just the falling in love with the symbolic representation of the teacher. The sense that he is somehow an emissary of enlightenment or something. And some situations try to prevent that idealization from happening too much. Some of them seem to actively encourage it. And of course, the situation where the teacher is sort of teaching from some kind of golden throne or some elevated position, where the teacher has to have their tea poured for them and their bag carried for them, and has to sort of drift along in special situations. Sometimes that's encouraging that kind of an exaggerated asymmetry between teacher and student. The Buddha's model, of course, was one of kalyanamitta. Kalyana meaning that which is edifying, uplifting. So he spoke about himself as an edifying friend, an uplifting friend. And that relationship of teacher to student as a relationship of uplifting friendship, edifying friendship. Very beautiful. We all need, you can recognize how much you benefit from those friendships that are edifying, that are uplifting. Those people with whom the contact you have with them nourishes something in you. And where the relationship, the teacher-student relationship, is about the edifying, the uplifting, the supporting of the student's practice, rather than the venerating, the googly eyeing of the teacher. And often, of course, idealization tends to break. And the more distorted the idealization is, the more painful it is when it breaks. And of course, so you're probably familiar with the kinds of examples, and the kinds of situations, maybe the kinds of teachers where that sort of veneration or and maybe a distortion of that is encouraged. But of course, there's a helpful way. What are you actually falling in love with? You can separate it from the personality of the teacher. If you can separate it out from the trappings of the teacher, the idea that the teacher has some kind of special or even more secret thing that they're able to, that you're hoping to get some scraps of. Somebody was telling me this morning about a situation, being with a teacher, where the first time they sat with that teacher, and the teacher led a meditation, and something special happened, something profound happened. They felt something in the field of the meditation. And of course that can be very seductive. And it also can be kind of manipulative. And yet there is, as I say, if one can separate out if you can see what is the love that's going on, is it, if it's connected to the personality of the teacher, to some sense of the teacher having something to bestow, that's there's a certain distortion in that, dangerous territory, I would say. It often ends up by feeding the teacher's position more than it ends up by edifying or supporting or uplifting the student's practice. But at the same time, maybe there is something to fall in love with. And maybe the teacher is an emissary, an exemplar of something, a reminder of something. And that's what we're actually being invited to fall in love with. Somebody who is able to represent, at least, if not actually express, that love of depth, love of freeness, love of possibility. And so that in that falling in love that may be there, we're actually able to recover and to recognize and recover and rest in, our own love of the deep, love of the free, love of that possibility. We might fall in love with the whole scenery of practice, the feeling of being around Buddhas, for example. I could definitely recognize that from my practice. Even though I didn't understand, and often still don't, like in Korea just now, So much of and I had a bunch of students with me asking endless questions about what each teaching mudra means on all the statues in the hall. Some of them I do, some of them I don't. Some of them I've never seen before. And so and earlier on in my practice, even less understanding of so much of the symbolism, and yet somehow just that edifying feeling, kalyana, that uplifting feeling, just being around Buddhist art and sculpture and temples and that feeling of devotion. And what a nice way to spend an afternoon, just walking around a temple, turning prayer wheels and mumbling a mantra. And just being in the field, it felt like, of a kind of something that pointed to love of depth and possibility, mystery. That can be very edifying. A reminder as well that we're not practicing in isolation. We're practicing actually in the company of all beings, in solidarity with all beings. We're also practicing in the company of countless others actually that have the similar sensibilities, similar aspirations. And that's a company that also stretches back over time. Practicing in the company of countless Dharma ancestors. And something reassuring about that. And some of us may feel that we have a kind of iconoclastic relationship to tradition. Maybe there's some appreciation and love of it, and there's some sort of doubt. I think it's good to have some doubt, because like we were saying the other day, any kind of organized religion, and Buddhism included, can be rigid in various ways, can be stuck in various ways. But personally, I think it's much more helpful and healthy to be rooted in a tradition while also checking out what's helpful to take and what's helpful to leave, what's supportive and what's stuck, etc. And then also to have the checks and balances of that tradition, to have kind of practice peers, teaching peers that can point out to us if we actually start to go off in some way, rather than not having that support apparatus, not having the language and the lineage and the goodness of the tradition. And yet we also see the ways of sort of falling in love with the tradition that can be rigid. And if we enter into a practice or a tradition or with a teacher, and then we enter into that sincerely and we get some benefit from that, and then if we're not careful, the fact that we've got the benefit and the fact that we've fallen in love with it, we start to think, this is the best. Because I felt the benefit. I can see, I've got the evidence of my experience that this is the great way to practice. This place or this practice or this technique or this teaching or this teacher or whatever. This is the best. And it's, maybe like you, I've had many decades of, being alarmed, surprised, disappointed, frustrated, to see how much people can withdraw out of what is essentially is the love of their practice and the love of the benefit they've gotten, but that it's gotten shut down into the sense that their way is somehow the right way, the best way, the truest way, etc. Maybe we fall in love with just a possibility. We fall in love with this vision of liberation. Beautiful. I think, if we're really gonna, if we're, our practice is gonna really ripen and deepen and roll on and be sustained. Seems to me, certainly, that's the only thing that really can hold that ongoing deepening practice. The fact that the point of our practice is liberation, a radical revolution in how we understand life, how we meet life, how we respond to life. And, in order to really love that, one has to have the sense that it's possible, at least possible, that it's available, and not available in many, many lifetimes from now. I once was some teachings in Dharamsala, where somebody asked a question to the teaching monk about enlightenment. And the response was that the best thing you could do is try to make good karma in this life. And maybe you'll have the good fortune to be reborn as a Tibetan in the next life, where you can really practice. Oops. Oh my goodness. And I had just come from being with my teacher in Thailand, Ajahn Buddhadasa, who had just made big waves in Thailand because he wrote a book called Nibbana for Everyone. And was very criticized in the sort of the Mahathera Sangha, the sort of venerable old uptight, the sort of Thai hierarchy of monasticism. Nibbana for everybody seems to be a kind of an outrage, a blasphemy. But no, pointing to that possibility. And what is this practice other than the invitation to Nibbana? Freeness, awakening. Of course, we can sometimes, maybe that's been the case for you at some point in your practice, we can fall in love with that possibility in an unhelpful way, in the sort of like the carrot on the stick of the donkey, where we're on the one hand, we're inspired by the possibility of being free from me. God, what a relief. That was one of the things that really turned me on early on in my practice. It's like, this promise of Nibbana means I wouldn't have to deal with me anymore. And some sense of trying to get away from myself. And where did I think I was going to go? Like John Kabat-Zinn's book says, wherever you go, there you are. And so we have to be careful. That love of possibility can be sincere, but if it can also be making a gap between where we think that promise is, like it's out there somewhere, and where we are. The gap of that possibility when my meditation's gotten deeper, when I've dealt with this or that problem, when I'm not so like this. Love isn't supposed to make a gap. Love is that which dissolves gap. If we want to be in love with that possibility, we need to feel for that possibility as close as possible. Which means here. The possibility of this moment, the possibility in a body like this, in a mind like this, what we were calling the open doorway. That which can never be more than a mind moment away. So, fall in love. Maybe we fall in love with the moment. As our practice deepens, Fall in love with what's possible actually in just being present. Fall in love with knowing a body that isn't racked with tension. And fall in love with knowing a mind that isn't trying to get anywhere or do anything. And fall in love with the availability that opens up. The way in which just seeing and hearing and sensing and perceiving start to reveal themselves to us, start to reveal the nature of seeing, the nature of hearing, the nature of perceiving, the nature of experiencing. And of course, we can see the ways we can fall in love with the moment in unhelpful or unhealthy ways. Some idea that I'm just supposed to be in the present moment, as if we could somehow eliminate any reference to past or future, which is impossible and unnecessary, because any sense of past and future just also belongs here. Where does our sense of future happen? Here. Where does our memory of past happen? Here. Let's not have a vision of the moment that's too narrow, that tries to squeeze so much out. But let's make room. Amidst our trying to be present, it might sometimes feel like a feature of our practice. Make room to actually fall in love. Make room to actually love the seeing, the hearing, the feeling, perceiving. To love the suchness. That word tatata, Pali word, the just like thisness, the ineffable quality, the ungraspable quality of the way our experience is fundamentally inconceivable and yet right here, indefinable and yet immediate, irreducible and yet completely available. These are all ways really of falling in love. Liberation. This promise, this real possibility of a free life, free from, the word that just came to mind was free from torturing ourselves, which might sound a bit strong, but it's kind of like that. Free from giving ourselves a hard time about anything, free from any kind of inner climate of harshness. Maybe that's a good definition of love. Free from harshness. Free from contraction. Free from push. Free from demand. Free from defense. Free life. Nothing more worthy of our love. Nothing more nourishing. And then freeness and love quite naturally then are synonymous, inseparable. Freeness is loving. Loving is freeness. So this is the possibility. This is the promise. This is the water that we're swimming in. This is the essence of our practice. What good fortune to know this love. May we know ourselves as the lover and the loved and the loving.